Hello there everyone, and welcome back to the channel Russia in Context. It has now been a week since the Tucker Carlson-Vladimir Putin interview blew up the internet. And in that time, there has been extensive discussion of what it means. Who looked good, who looked bad, who was right, who was wrong, all of that. There have also been approximately 800 million reaction videos to the interview. I'm not doing that here. I've personally been delayed in getting this video out for various reasons, but the one reason that is key is I ended up watching the interview twice, once with the translation and once in Russian, just to see if there were any major differences. What I will say is that the English version is quite good. There are a few ideas or phrases that I personally might have translated differently, but on the whole, what you heard in translation corresponds accurately. Anyway, in this video, I want to highlight what the reaction to the interview was here within the Russian internet media space. Obviously, the interview was intended for a foreign audience, but it was still watched far and wide here within Russia. They played it on the national television channels a few times in its entirety in the days after it was released. And there was a news story this last week from the city of Vologda, where they played the interview in a local cinema for people who missed it on TV or didn't know how to find it online. So it's worth having a look at what was said about the interview here in Russia. After that, I will give my own critiques and views on the whole thing. So how did the Russian press and political commentators react to the interview? Actually, before we get into that, I do want to note that the Russian elites, the heads of the government and the deputies in the Duma and Federation Council, none of them had much to say the day after the interview aired. To paraphrase Ilya Ananev, it seemed as though they were all standing firm, giving Tucker and the interview extra exclusivity. As many have pointed out in the Western media, there wasn't anything new to be gleaned from Putin's words, and Russians were also a little disappointed by that, it would seem. Georgy Boft, who thought the interview was a failure in terms of professionalism, recognized this lack of new material in the president's words. Quote, "For the Russian audience, there was nothing new, but the American audience had never before received such insight into Putin's views on the situation." While Boft believed that the interview might have some effect on the MAGA voter base, he believes the interview, in which Carlson merely functioned as a mic stand, will have no effect on the course of the military conflict. People on both ends of the political spectrum were surprised by what Putin didn't touch on over the 2 hours. Margarita Simonyan lamented the omission of traditional values, feeling it was a missed opportunity to advertise the country as a safe harbor for people who fear homosexuals and what she calls the woke religion, whereas Mikhail Svetov, a foreign agent, thought that Putin seemed unprepared to talk about the deep state and the sabotage of the state by bureaucratic apparatus, as in these discussions, quote, Putin should have shown. Just as in the West, analysts doubted the ability of Americans to sit through such a long history lesson, Maxim Zharov even felt it might be detrimental to the Kremlin's position, and that they should work with Carlson further. Journalist Vadim Shumilin also wondered if maybe Putin's history lesson about Ukraine wasn't miscalculated because, quote, he didn't consider that he was talking to an artificial state which was founded by separatists, refusing to recognize themselves as English, and which later would annex swaths of territory which had never before had any connection to them. The overwhelming reaction, though, was how the interview would improve Putin's image abroad, how it would humanize him, and more importantly, this fixation on Putin's desire to come to the negotiating table, but on Russia's terms. These were the main takeaways. The journalist Ekaterina Vinokurov noted that, quote, he smiled often, the distance between Putin and Tucker was lessened, no video conferences between conversing parties, just a small tea table. It would seem that not only has Moscow missed Western guests, for even Putin was visibly pleased to have a chance to speak to a Western audience in the guise of Carlson. Quote, Putin the Terrible, who the Russian domestic audience has gotten used to hearing, gave way to Putin the Moderate, the last European who is ready to, at any moment, sit down to the negotiating table. That said, Master Pera summed up the views with regards to diplomacy as such, quote, "The head of state made it clear that he is open to negotiations, but on the condition of observing Russian interests and the end of Western support for Ukraine. However, during the interview, it wasn't made clear what exactly the Russian conditions would be. The president, not in that interview or any time prior, ever used the word capitulation in relation to what is expected of the Ukrainian leaders and even of the US and the West. The Russian leader prefers hard-handed but delicate and diplomatic formulations, not laying all his cards on the table, leaving the audience to come to their own conclusions to key problems. Of course, the advantages to such an approach are obvious, but the situation is so stressed and heated that it will demand a coherent explanation on the key questions." My thoughts on the speech are mixed. From an informational point of view, I can't say I was disappointed, for I wasn't expecting much in the first place. So when Putin rambled off his greatest hits of the last few years, I even found myself mentally checking out from time to time. For real, all the talking points he hit on in the interview, he has repeated again over the course of the following week. I'm also not surprised that Tucker didn't push harder and ask Putin pointed questions, because I doubt Carlson is well versed in modern Russian politics and the history of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict as it has developed over the last decade, something which Putin does have knowledge of. And so if Tucker had, tried asking such a question, it likely would have ended with him looking, at best, unprepared, and at worst, uninformed and foolish. That said, some of the questions, like the one about AI, seemed completely unrelated to anything, and I don't really get why they were asked in the first place. Some people, myself included, were again upset with Carlson not asking hard questions, but thinking about it, it seems likely that Putin kind of dictated the terms of the interview to some degree. So if he didn't like the tone or direction that the interview was going, he could have just ended it, which would have been bad for Carlson. I do, however, wish that Carlson had followed up on certain questions, or, maybe even had some basic knowledge to just push a little bit. Putin was able to do, whatever he wanted because he disoriented Carlson with his history lesson at the beginning. As I'm guessing, Carlson was probably not expecting that in the slightest, which seemingly upended the roles and put Putin firmly in charge. Also, his first comment about the talk show or a serious conversation is a false dichotomy, which immediately knocked Carlson just down a little bit and made any more pushing by Tucker, it would have seemed like insincerity or unprofessionalism on his part. By not rebuffing this, Tucker looked a little weak, and he handed complete control over to Putin. When Putin brought out the documents that he showed, he clearly had every intention of steering the interview in such a way as to allow him space to lay out his view of Russian-Ukrainian history, just because there's no other way. He would have had, just copies of those documents with him. That's not something that people would normally take with them. That said, Carlson seemed flustered at this, which is understandable, right? As Bogdan Khmelnytsky's letters from centuries ago don't really have anything to do with, realistically what's happening today. Part of the reason Tucker's lack of pushback was frustrating is because it really would have been nice to hear Putin, just dig into his ideas and the logic behind him, as there are plenty of counter arguments to some of the points, that he made. Now, I'm not going to attempt to parse what his explanation would have been, nor go out of control with my own explanations, but I am going to show some clips here and just present a basic, valid follow-up question that could have been given, the response to which would have been informative.
But before World War I, using the ideas of Ukraine, ethnicity and origin, the Austrian General Staff started promoting the Ukrainian origin and Ukrainian identity.
Okay, so ignoring the fact that the Ukrainian language and culture had existed in the Russian Empire already in the 19th century, and that steps had been taken to root it out by the Russian Empire, if this artificial idea was planted, doesn't the fact that it took root in an era before mass media lend, I don't know, at least some credence to the explanation that the people already identified as such, or otherwise it wouldn't have been adopted so readily? Also, isn't it possible that the Ukrainians always viewed themselves as existing to some degree, but simply without a state? After all, we recognize the existence nowadays of the Kurds, who are a group of people without their own country, and who often refuse to identify with the nationalities of the countries they inhabit, largely because the borders of said countries were just drawn atop Kurdish historic lands. And this also reminds me of how Putin used the term artificial a number of times when he was discussing Ukraine as a country. But why did Tucker let that term slide? What did Putin mean by that? If we assume a country that was drawn with arbitrary borders and which includes within said borders a mix, a collection of peoples, then Russia is exactly the same, as is most of Europe and Africa and pretty much every country on the face of the earth. And sure, it could be argued that Ukraine and Russia share basically the same culture, history, and even language to a degree. But then again, so do Germany and Austria, and they exist as separate countries. I just want to point out that Putin's history overview just kind of ultimately petered out, and it didn't really come to any grand or final point, any specific conclusion. And to me, it felt just more like a collection of insinuations that Ukraine is actually Russia, or part of it should be at any rate. So I do understand why Tucker maybe thought it was kind of a stalling technique, because it kind of didn't really lead to anything specific. Listen, I know this is opening just a huge can of worms, and that the comments are probably going to be ripe with, well, actually type of, arguments. But I have to bring up NATO. So first off, NATO membership it's not forced onto any country, right? They all apply for it of their own volition, right? Perhaps not the best analogy here, but the expansion of BRICS, which just happened this last year, it didn't cause anyone to bat an eye, although it goes beyond the scope of the original group, right? So why did nobody get upset? Because the countries that joined BRICS made the decision to do so. Sure, NATO is a military defensive organization, but basically the same logic applies.
Told him, Bill, what do you think if Russia asked to be admitted into NATO? Do you think it would happen? He said, it's interesting. I think yes. But in the evening, when we had another meeting for dinner, he said, I've talked to my team. No, not going to happen, not now.
Putin even mentioned that Russia asked to be a part of NATO, which really wasn't a surprise for anyone who knows their history. But why not just then go through the application process like everyone else? I know some will, kind of be quick to say that NATO would have left Russia in limbo, or that there's no way that Poland would have voted to allow Russia in. But again, we're theorizing and talking about 2 decades ago. If Russia had expressed interest, through the proper channels, not some off-the-cuff comments to Bill Clinton, and if Russia had undertaken the required steps of political, economic, and military reform, who's to say that Russia couldn't have become a key member of the alliance? Now, that said, I think most would agree that Russia had no real intentions of reforming their systems in that direction. Putin seems to have just brought up this topic to highlight his past desire to integrate with and become part of the West, but there is obviously more to the process.
To the fact that after 1991, when Russia expected that it would be inducted into the brotherly nation of civilized nations, it didn't happen. Well, you tricked us. Well, I'm not talking about you personally. I'm talking about the U.S.
Also, I remember what Russia was like a decade, 2 decades ago, and this whole victim complex of Russia not being part of the civilized world, kind of as Putin was talking about. I don't buy it. Russians traveled across Europe freely, and Europeans came to Russia often, right? The country was welcome to all sorts of international competitions. Foreign companies had these sort of large-scale representations on the Russian market, and Russians were readily kind of hired into these corporations. The G7 was even expanded to the G8 to make room for Russia. The West was absolutely interested in further welcoming Russia kind of into the club, but largely on its terms, which is kind of fair. When the relationship began to sour, that's another discussion entirely. But these could have all been points made by Carlson that could have, pushed Putin to give us more answers that would have given us more insight into his way of thinking. Finally, we have these clips.
If you had evidence, and presumably given your security services, your intel services, you would, that NATO, the US, CIA, the West, did this, why wouldn't you present it and win a propaganda victory?
And we've got the response, basically, from the CIA and the archives. And the response goes as follows. So, yes, we have worked with the opposition forces in Russia, and we think it is the right thing to do, and we will continue doing that.
Tucker did actually ask for evidence on both of these claims, but Putin just sort of chuckled and dismissed the idea, saying that showing the proof would put his sources in danger, and that it wouldn't make any difference because, well, the US controls the world press, so any revelations would just get buried. But like the Tucker interview, according to some counts done by the Russian media, has been watched across various platforms and reposts something like 1 billion times in a week. If Putin had brought his evidence and showed it, it would have been seen by hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of people online, and it would have been impossible to keep quiet. So that leaves me with sort of two explanations for why he didn't. Either the evidence just simply doesn't exist, or it isn't as clear-cut as Putin makes it out to be, or he does have evidence but is afraid to expose it for fear that the West could then, turn around and declassify their own documents, which would paint Putin or the Russian government in a more negative light. Regardless, I don't really buy into that. Again, that's just me. So those are a few examples of things which I think it would have been nice to see a little bit more of a pushback on. I feel like those are all valid questions that Carlson could have asked Putin, and which would have, just at least been interesting to see his response. Just, again, a follow-up to a lot of these statements that Putin made. I feel like that's basic journalism, but what do I know, right? My final thoughts are such. Putin mentioned multiple times stories when Russia attempted to move closer to the West, and then was rebuffed. As with his history, there is definitely some cherry picking going on here, though, again, kind of considering his age, it's possible he's not doing all of it intentionally. The framing of all modern international woes between the West and Russia as the former's fault, it's just clearly false. Both sides are to blame for numerous reasons. It's just like this unhealthy relationship where both parties kind of keep an itemized list of all these little transgressions that the other has done. It's just not good. And despite Putin trying to place what is happening today within the context sort of that stretches back over a millennium, what we're seeing today is something that kind of for years I've called this Cold War hangover. The prior rationale for the animosity between the two countries has disappeared, but the systems themselves, well, they were constructed to oppose each other. And it doesn't really help that today's leaders of Russia and the States are both dyed-in-the-wool products of the Cold War generations. In the years immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West, but the US in particular, well, they felt victorious, and as victors tend to dictate the conditions of defeat, they felt no great need to heed Russia's concerns. Russia, on the other hand, which, in the words of Putin, had seen itself as rulers of the Soviet Union, kind of an extension of the Russian Empire in the guise of socialism, it had just lost millions of square kilometers of territory and millions of citizens when all of the former client states of the USSR split away. And Russia was reeling, but still felt itself the geopolitical heavyweight it had been only years before. And when it was no longer treated as such by the West, it felt resentment, justified or not. In the end, both countries or sides, or however you want to frame this, they dislike each other not because of their differences, but because when looking at the other side, they are faced with their own shortcomings. Things that are developed and work well in one country or on one side are often lacking in their transoceanic compatriot, and vice versa. And we can't resolve our problems. There's just a general refusal of both sides to listen and work together, and a lack of interest in doing so, and this has slowly brought us to where we are today, though some may be more to blame than others. The political pride on both sides needs to just be toned way down. I remember when I was in university, right? I had chosen to study Russian and Russian Eastern European studies because I had fallen in love with the literature in high school and the country fascinated me. This was post 9/11, so everyone's focus was on the Arab world, and I remember there being discussion as to the need for Russian specialists in the future. Was there any? After all, they were no longer a threat. Russia wasn't. They were a partner, and they were an ally in the making. I often wondered if I had made a mistake in that regard, that my knowledge and insight might not be all that necessary in the future. I watched as Russian departments across the United States, as they shrank in universities, and some even disappeared. Yet in the last decade, and certainly within the last 2 years, it's become clear that I hadn't misjudged, that the need to understand this country and its people, to understand the mentality of Russia through history and culture, to understand what's happening in the current day through the lenses of the past, that's all still very much needed. So maybe that wasn't all about the interview. Maybe it was, I'm not sure. It all feels related. It's a complicated subject, and there are so many threads intertwined. It's a knot where when you start tugging on one part, 3 more pop up and they kind of demand your attention over here. But I suppose that's history and international politics and just the complexity of discussing a country such as Russia. I don't know. I hope this has been informative or thought-provoking or entertaining. I mean, if you've made it this far, it's likely at least one of those things. Anyway, as always, leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, do the YouTube checklist. You know how it goes. To end things this time, I think it would be appropriate if I let Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin give me a hand to wrap things up. So this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.
Закончим? Или что-то еще?
Shall we end here, or is there anything else?
No, I think that's great.
Спасибо.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Спасибо большое.
Спасибо.
Thank you.